One warm summer, Grandfather Arthur, an elderly man who had spent most of his life in the countryside, decided to take one of his usual walks through the forest near his small village. He loved the quiet solitude of the woods, the rustling of the leaves, and the way nature seemed to embrace him. The forest was his refuge, a place where he found peace. As he wandered deeper into the woods, something unusual caught his eye. Under a bush, curled up and hidden from plain sight, was a small creature. At first, Arthur wasn't sure what it was, but as he got closer, he realized it was a wolf cub, a tiny pup, barely skin and bones. The sight tugged at his heart. The cub looked so helpless, lying there without any signs of movement. Arthur approached slowly, expecting the cub to flee, but it didn't. The wolf cub remained where it was, too weak to move. As Arthur bent down for a closer look, the little creature tried to scurry away but failed. Arthur noticed something was wrong. The cub's front paw was injured, likely broken, and it couldn't walk properly. "What happened to you, little one?" Arthur thought aloud as the cub gazed up at him with tired eyes. It was clear the poor thing had been abandoned, perhaps by its mother who might have thought it wouldn't survive. Arthur's heart ached. He had a soft spot for animals and couldn't just leave it there to die. Gently, Arthur picked up the cub, wrapping it carefully in a bag to carry it back home. The small creature didn't resist. It was too weak to fight back. Once at home, Arthur examined the wolf cub's paw, confirming that it was indeed broken. With the care and precision of a man who had tended to animals his whole life, Arthur set the paw between the cub's shoulder blades and bandaged it, ensuring that the bones would heal properly. The cub winced in pain, but it didn't try to bite or escape. It seemed to understand that Arthur was trying to help. Arthur set up a comfortable place for the cub just outside his house. He made sure it had food and water, feeding it bits of meat and scraps from his kitchen. Over the next few weeks, the wolf cub began to grow stronger. Arthur could see its transformation. The once skinny and fragile pup grew bigger and healthier, and its injured paw slowly healed. Though the cub still had a slight limp, it was otherwise strong and full of life. Arthur grew attached to the little wolf and named it Gray, after its silvery fur. Gray became a part of Arthur's daily life, following him around the yard and even accompanying him on his walks through the forest. The wolf cub had become completely tame, behaving more like a loyal dog than a wild animal. Whenever Arthur called its name, Gray would come running, its tail wagging and eyes full of trust. In the village, people often saw Arthur and Gray together. It was a strange sight to see a wolf so attached to a human, but everyone admired the bond they shared. Among those most fond of Gray was Alyosha, the neighbor's young son. Alyosha, just a boy, was drawn to the playful nature of the wolf cub. The two became fast friends, spending their days playing in the fields and around the village. Every day, Alyosha would bring treats for Gray, and the wolf cub would happily take them, wagging its tail in delight. For a year, Gray lived with Arthur, and Alyosha spent nearly every day with his new friend. The bond between the boy and the wolf was special, and Arthur watched them with joy, knowing how rare it was to see such a relationship between a wild animal and a child. But as Gray grew older, something changed. One day, without warning, Gray disappeared. Arthur searched for him everywhere, but the wolf was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Gray. Arthur knew deep down that Gray's wild instincts had likely taken over, and the wolf had returned to the forest where it belonged. As much as Gray had become a part of their family, it was still a wild creature at heart. Alyosha was heartbroken by the disappearance of his friend. The boy cried for days, unable to understand why Gray had left. Arthur tried to comfort him, promising that when Alyosha was older, he would bring him a shepherd puppy from the city. It was a small comfort, but Alyosha never forgot Gray, the wolf who had been his companion for a year. 2 years passed, and life in the village returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Arthur, now an older man, continued his peaceful life. walking through the woods and tending to his small home. Gray was nothing but a memory now, a chapter of his life he cherished but had accepted was over. Then one summer day, something happened that changed everything. Alyosha's mother, Maria, came running to Arthur's house in tears. "Alyosha is missing," she cried. "He went out this morning and he hasn't come back. I think he might have gone into the forest to pick berries, but he's lost." Fear gripped Arthur's heart. He knew the dangers of the forest, especially for a young boy. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed his hunting equipment and set out into the woods to search for Alyosha. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of the boy. The deeper Arthur went into the forest, the more his worry grew. Suddenly, Arthur heard a noise from the thicket. Something was rushing toward him, breaking branches and leaves with great force. Instinctively, Arthur raised his gun, ready to defend himself. From the shadows emerged a large wolf, galloping toward him with powerful leaps. Its fur was raised, and its eyes gleamed with wild intensity. Arthur froze. The wolf was huge and fast, and for a moment, Arthur thought it was coming to attack him. But then he noticed something familiar. The wolf was limping on its front paw. In that instant, a memory flashed through his mind. Could it be Gray? With his gun still raised, Arthur called out, "Gray!" The wolf stopped in its tracks, staring at Arthur. It hesitated for a moment, as if recognizing the voice. Then it took a few slow steps toward him before turning around and walking back into the thicket, glancing over its shoulder as if beckoning Arthur to follow. Arthur's heart raced. What was Gray trying to show him? Without a second thought, he followed the wolf through the forest. After a short distance, Arthur reached a small clearing, and there, lying in the bushes, was Alyosha, fast asleep. And next to him, standing guard, was Gray. The wolf had found Alyosha and stayed by his side, protecting him just as it had done years ago when they were friends. Tears welled up in Arthur's eyes. "So this is where you've been, Gray," he exclaimed. "You've been protecting Alyosha all along." As Arthur bent down to pick up the boy, Gray stepped back, whining softly. Though the wolf had once been tame, it was clear that it now feared humans again. Time in the wild had changed Gray, and though it remembered its old friend Arthur, the wolf was still wary. It no longer saw humans as companions, but as potential threats. Arthur cradled Alyosha in his arms and whispered, "Thank you, Gray. You saved him." The wolf stood watching as Arthur began walking back toward the village with Alyosha. Gray followed at a distance, limping slightly as it trailed behind. When they reached the edge of the forest, where the fields began, Gray stopped. It stood there, watching as Arthur carried Alyosha away. The wolf's eyes were filled with a mixture of longing and sadness. It had returned to the wild, but a part of it still remembered the life it had lived with Arthur and Alyosha. Arthur turned one last time to look at Gray. "Go on now, Gray," he said softly. "You belong in the forest." Gray howled, a long, plaintive sound that echoed through the trees. It was a farewell, a final goodbye to the man and boy who had once been its family. Slowly, the wolf turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Arthur and Alyosha behind. As Arthur walked back to the village, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Gray had returned, if only for a moment, to save his friend. The bond they had shared might have been broken by time and distance, but in the end, Gray had remembered. Back at home, Alyosha woke up and learned of how Gray had protected him. Tears filled his eyes as he realized that his old friend had come back, even if only for a little while. Arthur and Alyosha sat together, sharing stories of the wolf they had loved and lost. They knew they would never see Gray again, but they were comforted by the knowledge that, wherever he was, he would always be watching over them. And somewhere deep in the forest, Gray howled one last time, a lonely cry that lingered in the air, a farewell to the life it had once known.